So Kokomi Mono Hydro is a team that's been getting increasingly popular, especially in CN. Some of us have been playing it and finding it a lot of fun. However, I know myself and maybe some of you, if you've ever tried to explain or show it to someone in the global community, you generally get met with, isn't Fischl just an upgrade, or why would you play 3 Hydros instead of an Electro or Pyro, it's a DPS loss. That's what I've been getting. Now there's 2 overall topics for today's video. Number 1, the fundamental misunderstandings on why exactly you would play Mono Hydro, and that the creation of the team is well thought out and not just a mono element gimmick. And number 2, calcs that can show it objectively weaker are arguably limited and may not be telling the full story. So the first point, the misunderstandings on why play the team. Actually, this team gels well the way it is, doesn't have room for an Electro, and actually an Electro doesn't fit the idea at all. You see, if I can break it down, the team is essentially how much damage can we squeeze from the double Hydro core whilst maintaining a balanced and complete team. And this 4-man Mono Hydro team is a team designed to maximize this, and like I mentioned in my Mono Pyro video, the end result of this, it just happens to have Hydro members. Now I would just like to clarify that obviously a huge weakness for this team is shield breaking, especially Hydro itself. Hydro itself was never that universal with breaking shields, and if you're not fighting a Pyro shield, you can be struggling. Now the first thing you can say is, why Kokomi? Yelan on field would get her A4 damage buff. Isn't that the way to get her the highest output? Here's the thing, between Yelan and Xingqiu, neither heal. So you've got 2 characters who don't heal, and usually mono teams try add Kazuha, who is the premier elemental buffer, but a team of those 3, you would effectively force the last slot to either be a healer or a shield. So what options do we have? Archaic Petra Zhongli. Well, Zhongli doesn't actually generate much energy or damage himself, so not only would the double Hydro core be pushed to have to run higher ER, because Zhongli doesn't do much damage himself, you're effectively needing the double Hydro core to do the entire team's damage output by themselves. Okay, what other options do we have? Now obviously I could say Hu Tao. She doesn't need Bennett and can drive this core for high damage. This is a genuine solution to the team. I play this team quite a bit, it's very powerful. However, not everyone can play Hu Tao. A lot of people obviously find it too difficult to play. They may be struggling with jump cancelling on C0, and there are ultimately people that would argue a shieldless Hu Tao team isn't complete for most players. Whereas Kokomi being Hydro lowers ER requirements, meaning she frees up the double Hydro core to use fully offensive weapons. She also takes the defensive utility role, being a great healer, allowing you to play Kazuha with no strings attached, and together both her and Kazuha take little field time away from driving, as the team can be constantly normal attacking. Also, similar to Hu Tao here, she does not miss having Bennett at all, so effectively Kokomi hops on the same train as the double Hydro core and eats all the same buffs they are. If you wanted to play someone like Ayato here, he benefits a lot from Bennett's attack, so Ayato is not going to be at peak performance at all. Secondly, he doesn't heal, so bringing in Kazuha will have issues. And then lastly, he either has too little duration on his skill, or if you use it twice per cycle, then he extends the rotation at the expense of the rest of the team. See, in this scenario it would absolutely be a mono element gimmick. Ayato isn't fleshing out the team at all. Okay, so some of you may have noticed I said Kazuha also takes little field time away. You can actually see in the CN rotation they don't actually use Kazuha's burst at all. Instead they build him for full EM and full buffing. Why? Because his burst loses too many Yelan and Xingqiu triggers to be worth it, and focusing purely on buffing seems to be better. Obviously, if you're fighting something like Ruined Serpent with dead time, similarly if you're fighting a bunch of mobs, then use it for AoE damage, but yeah, just build him for as much EM as possible otherwise. Now as I say this does bring me to the second topic, which is how low budget calcs may not be telling the full story. There are some people who have calced it and saying it's not exactly standing out. Why is that? One thing I like about the Chinese style of calcing is that they focus more on the overall amount of gold pulls. See, a lot of people might say, why would you bother calcing with a 5-star weapon? But actually look at it, it's 4 gold pulls total. You know, there are popular Ayato teams or Ganyu teams or other teams which have 4 gold pulls just for the characters themselves. The TLDR is simple, some teams scale better than others with investment, and only theory crafting at one level of investment can mess with evaluations. So I'm sure most of you know this by now, but generally on YouTube and in Discord, for Western TC generally people tend to look at C6 4 stars and C0 5 stars, built artifacts with around 20 chosen optimized substats, and we don't really factor in 5-star weapons in evaluations since weapon banners I suppose are less normalized here than somewhere like CN, which is fair enough. We would generally look at R5 if it's free to play, maybe R3 if it's gacha, and R1 if it's something like a battle pass weapon. So can you already spot the problem here? Let's look at Xiangling. Now what do people generally assume in team calculations for her? She would be at C6 and she would have access to a free to play weapon, which is the catch. As many of you may know, the catch at R5 is pretty much her best weapon in general, or at least around about there, and she's C6, so effectively you could say a YouTube guide or theory crafter is looking at a peak potential Xiangling. Now a similar thing, let's look at Sucrose, again C6. You would assume the player has triple EM artifacts, 20 substats would allow ER and offensive substats if needed. She would also use TTDS or sac frags in this role, even Hakushin depending on the team. Again, effectively, she is using her actual best and sort weapon fully built. This also goes for all Alamos in general, but a player's VV sets are almost always going to be worse than one you assume in calculations. Generally, triple EM VV is hard enough, let alone being able to get decent ER or crit rate as needed. So even for Kazuha, since a lot of players like using Fav Sword on him anyway, he's not exactly at peak potential at C0R0, but he's fairly close. 2 more examples of not quite peak potential, but almost there, would be Bennett and Xingqiu. Bennett, since Western TC wouldn't really assume Aquila Pavonia, his buff won't quite be at max, but you can still give him something like Ali Flash with its high base attack, and Bennett doesn't really need much artifact substats anyway. With Xingqiu, not all of his teams can easily let him run Primordial Jade Cutter anyway. A lot of people still use Fav or Sac Sword for uptime regardless, which is often assumed, and again him being at C6 is huge for these. Now you may have noticed something here which could go either way. If you want to look at it with a glass half full perspective, you can say a national team, as long as you have the high cons where needed, is cheap and reasonable to reach peak potential. So it's okay for content creators and Calcs to have this almost peak potential team as their comparison. But for another perspective, glass half empty, you could say that you're comparing characters with their ceilings capped versus characters who with conventional assumptions aren't even near to their full potential. So we in fact, due to these more budget calculation mindsets, are ignoring ceilings. Now hopefully that was a bit helpful. If we can bring this video back to the team of discussion, Mono Hydro, you may look at the previous exercise and say, well, Yelan has Favonius Bow, which is basically of her best 4-star weapon. She is very strong as a free-to-play character. Kokomi has TTDS and Prototype Amber, and she doesn't need to do damage. And we already talked about Xingqiu and Kazuha having good assumptions. What's the issue? Well, the issue is, Favbow Yelan is seen as very strong because a lot of her teams she needs a lot of ER. What happens if you place her in a Mono Hydro team and Favbow is still the weapon used? Well, the lower ER you go, and the more the team is focused on Yelan's damage, the less effective Favbow gets relatively to Aqua Simulacra. Not only that, but with lower ER, Xingqiu also starts to get a lot of value from 5-star weapons. Now this can actually start a butterfly effect, because the less you can take advantage of the double Hydro's power, the lower damage they do, meaning relatively, the more damage Kazuha does. As I said before, for the CN Calcs, which use 5-star weapons on the double Hydro core and C1R1 on Kokomi, Kazuha's burst is a DPS loss. But if you keep them on weaker weapons, you can actually shift the balance to the point where his burst isn't necessarily a DPS loss, which means you build him for ER and lower damage bonus, further lowering the Hydro character's output. And now all of a sudden, the team's recommended rotation and builds are completely different. Now do you see how assumptions can change everything? And I haven't even gotten to Kokomi yet. You may or may not be surprised to know she actually does a lot of damage in the team, even more with C1 and Moonglow. How cool is that? And that's another thing which can completely change depending on perception. See, if you used Fischl instead of Xingqiu for a lower budget taser team, then Kokomi's ER requirements would shoot up. Not only that, but you'd probably end up giving her TTDS to buff Fischl. And now in your team, Kokomi is not really there for damage, but for driving, healing and buffing support, meaning you would see less value in her C1 and Moonglow. People think of Moonglow as a terrible weapon, but is it really that bad when you place her in the right situation, right team? Something to think about. Here's the CN rotation for the team. I've recorded my own gameplay following it. You're supposed to actually get 16 rain swords throughout, but it can be tricky to min-max. To make things easier, you don't actually have to follow this rotation exactly, as long as you follow the key concepts. Number 1, always start with Yelan to position yourself and apply Hydra onto enemies. Now you want to basically have 100% uptime on the VV debuff, so Kazuha goes after. Then use all your skills, and just before you're ready to drive with Kokomi, make sure to refresh VV and redo Yelan's E, since you want to use Yelan's E before and after Kokomi to keep ER requirements low. And then lastly, spam left click with the team constantly in between skills. Hopefully now this should be more easier to follow. So if I compare my calc results to the ones on NGA, I actually got fairly close. However, they do have slightly different assumptions, like they use 24 substats and slightly different ER requirements. I don't know exactly, but the end result is fairly close. Also, if some of you were interested, here is a summary of the evaluation of the team from the NGA poster. Finally, just a quick recap of the team. It definitely struggles in shield breaking content. It definitely is single target focused. However, it is very comfortable and fun to play with high damage. You get to use your Kokomi, Yelan and Xingqiu to their full potential. Kazuha doesn't even need ER artifacts, and you can fully concentrate on stacking EM to buff the team. Lastly, it seems to scale higher and higher the more investment you have. Not that I'm encouraging spending. Rather, I look at it as getting more value than you normally would from your investments.